Now let's take on Standard 5, and this one deals with investment analysis, recommendations, and actions. And Standard 5A is diligence and a reasonable basis. So diligence and reasonable basis, this says we have to exercise diligence, independence, thoroughness in analyzing investments, making investment decisions, and of course taking investment actions. And then we have to have a reasonable basis, okay, supported by research for our analysis, recommendations, or actions. So this says that when we're doing something, anything in the professional realm, here specifically referring to analyzing a firm, making recommendations, or taking investment action, okay, then we have to have we have to be diligent and have a reasonable basis for our conclusions. So what we've seen so far, when I talk about my 3 pillars, okay, is pillar number 1, as you remember, was loyalty and objectivity. So that was, we have to have the right mindset to start with. So we've got to be able to go and say, well, we're gonna act in this client's best interest, and our judgment hasn't been tainted. So the problem with conflict of interest is that it actually causes our synapses in our head to fire off differently, and it makes it very difficult to determine what is in the client's best interest. So avoiding conflicts, being objective, and then recognizing your fiduciary responsibility. 3, the one we're dealing with now, okay, this is going to be diligence and a reasonable basis. So I'm just going to put basis here. So diligence and a reasonable basis for our recommendations. So we have to understand, we have to make the effort to be able to understand the risk-return parameters of whatever it is that we are analyzing. We can think of it as making portfolio recommendations. And then the second one, as we talked about, was suitability, right? So the point here is that when we are acting for the benefit of our client, first of all, we've got to make sure that we understand where our duty of loyalty lies. We have to be prepared to exercise our responsibilities along that line of responsibility properly by being objective. Okay? We have to understand the assets or securities or recommendations that we're actually promulgating. So we've got to have a basis supported by research. It can't be that we talk to somebody and they said, oh, I think this is a good idea. It's got to be some sort of analysis that uses data that gets unbiased data from multiple sources, those types of things. And then even if we are, have good hearts in the way that we do this, okay, and we have done all the research that could possibly be done and understand a security or issue or whatever it is as well as we are possibly capable of, remember, we still have to explicitly consider the suitability for the client. So these are what I think of as the 3 pillars. Of course, there's lots of stuff that goes around this, and all of it supports, this is all interwoven. Okay, but if you want to think about what it takes to be able to make a recommendation and the way you approach a question on the exam, remember that we've got to have these 3 things in place. And if we do, there's other stuff out there. Of course, the responsibility of supervisors is linked to this, but it's not as direct. Okay, and there's other things going on that we need to make sure we are aware of. Okay, but these 3 things cover lots of ground when it comes to CFA exams and those types of things. So anyway, keep that in mind. We have to be diligent. We have to have a reasonable basis supported by research. So guidance here: make a reasonable effort to cover all relevant issues when arriving at an investment recommendation. Okay, the word all scares me. I think for exam purposes, this is a relatively high standard. So, do you have to understand what's happening with, pharmaceuticals in Asia in order to be able to understand wheat futures on a U.S. exchange? Maybe not, but if they bring it up in the exam and they make any sort of tangential relationship, well, then I would be slow to ignore that as something that would need to be considered. So the level of diligence, of course, is going to depend on the product or service offered. Okay, so we can have things that are for public release. We could also be asked to do very thorough analysis and say an M&A project or something like that. So using secondary or third-party research, okay, we can use with proper attribution where you can use secondary or third-party research. But you are responsible for making a determination of its soundness. So you've got to look at the assumptions, the rigor, the timeliness, and the independence of this third party. So you're welcome to pull that into your research, to report it, as long as it has proper attribution. Okay, but remember, once you report it, Okay, you are essentially saying I've investigated its rigor and the independence of the original author or creator of it, and I think this is something that's worth considering. So we want to encourage the firm to adopt a policy of periodic review for the quality of third-party research. How do we evaluate that? What are what assumptions are we looking for? Sort of timeliness issues. I mean, so is this something that's been generated or updated in the last 12 months, or is it something from 1973? Those types of things. So we ought to be encouraging our firms to have some sort of policy about how we evaluate these third parties. Okay, if we're going to, in terms of recommendations, we should establish a policy that research recommendations should have a reasonable and adequate basis. Okay, that ought to be something at the firm level. If the firm doesn't have that policy, you, as someone who is subject to the code and standards, you're still going to have to do that. And then have a review or an approval process for research reports and recommendations prior to external circulation. So this is just part of the check and balance, right? So you're going to generate this report, or someone that you're supervising generating a report. There ought to be some formal process in place to review or have an approval before we send that out to the rest of the world. And in terms of due diligence procedures, well, we ought to have some due diligence procedures for judging if a recommendation has met reasonable and adequate basis standards. So there ought to be some measurable criteria for assessing the quality of research, how many years of data it uses, the quality of the data that it obtained, was it the best data available, all those types of things. There's nothing in the code and standards to tell us how to go about doing this, okay? But we ought to have some way of doing it, and some sort of measurable criteria for saying, yes, this is something that we think has a reasonable and adequate basis. Okay, we ought to consider scenarios outside recent experience when we're looking at tail risk. So this actually is something that came into the code and standards after 2008. So we did lots of sensitivity scenario analysis on CDOs and other collateralized debt obligation type things, where we were looking at, well, here is the default rate on subprime mortgages. The highest it's ever been in 1 year is 6%. Well, let's double that. Wow, that's way outside recent experience, and it still turned out to not be high enough, right? So we'd had to triple or quadruple it to actually get a handle on that. So just because its default rates had been in a range of 3 to 5% annually over the last 4 or 5 years, well, and this is a recommendation, right? But looking at the last 3 or 4 years in terms of what is possible is probably not very good economics or analysis. So make sure the firm has the procedures to evaluate these external advisors that they use or promote, including how often we're going to go through and evaluate them. And finally here on diligence and reasonable basis, we want to have written procedures for acceptable scenario testing, range of scenarios, that type of thing. Cash flow sensitivities, the assumptions, the way we derive our inputs and distributions. We need procedures for evaluating outside information providers, which would include how often we're going to go do that. And I think somewhat importantly down here, this is something that gives you a little bit of safe harbor, and that is that there's no need to dissociate from group research that a member disagrees with. So you can imagine yourself in a group that is vetting buy-sell recommendations out of a research office. So, well, you've got 5 people on the committee that makes the final determination. You think this should be a sell. Everybody else thinks it should be a buy. Okay. Well, if you think it should be a sell, everybody else thinks it's a buy. It goes out as a buy. Do you have to, list on there that you're the dissenting member? Or do you have to leave the firm over it? Well, no. Okay. If the rest of the committee was not living up to the requirement of diligence and reasonable basis, if they said, oh, we're going to give this a buy recommendation because it's good for our investment banking business, then that's a violation. Then you would have to dissociate from that. But just because, this is economics, finance, valuation, there's plenty of room for reasonable people to differ. So if, there's been a reasonable investigation of the parameters involved in this recommendation or investment action, and you happen to be a dissenting view, Well, that doesn't mean that you necessarily have to dissociate from it. It does mean that there has to be a good faith effort on all of the members of the group, or the members of the group, before this recommendation goes out. So as long as there was a good faith effort, you don't have to dissociate with it merely because you were a dissenter. Of course, you should write that down, because then when you were right, you're going to want to remind the rest of the members of the group about that. All right, so that's standard 3A, diligence and reasonable basis. Let's talk about and I said 3A, I meant 5A. So let's talk about 5B, which is communication with clients and prospective clients, all right? So what is it? We've talked about performance presentation previously. That was the fair, accurate, and complete, okay? But now we're talking about what it is we need to communicate. So we have to disclose the basic format or general principles of the investment procedures or models that we use to construct portfolios or to arrive at our conclusions. Okay? We don't have to give away the farm. We don't have to show everybody our proprietary mathematical models, but we do have to give people enough information so that they understand how we're approaching the investment problem. Okay? And then, if we're going to change the way we do that, okay, we've told the world we're doing it under these principles, and we're changing those now. Well, we've got to promptly disclose any changes that would materially affect the process. Now, if we update our analysis of the equity risk premium or something, that's not something we got to jump through a lot of hoops for. But if we're going to change from, being fundamental analyst to technical analyst or something like that, well, then that's going to require some very prompt disclosure to the people who we provide services to. So disclose risks and limitations associated with the investment process. So use reasonable judgment. Again, this always worries me, and when I read reasonable in this material and I'm taking a CFA exam, I always think use almost unreasonable judgment and unreasonably high standards for your judgment. But nonetheless, the point is there's a high threshold here. So use reasonable judgment in identifying which factors are important to the investment analysis, okay, the recommendations or the actions. So you have to use reasonable judgment in identifying, okay, the factors that are going to be adequate to describe the risks and limitations of our investment process when you're talking or communicating with clients. And we want to include those facts in communication when we communicate. So when we're communicating, hey, this is what we'd like to do for you. This is what we're trying to achieve. This is how we go about doing it. These would be the limitations or the risks. So we've got to treat both sides of the equation, and we've got to be giving our clients enough information so that they can make informed decisions. So we want to distinguish between fact and opinion. So it's one thing to say, hey, sales are going to grow at 15% for the next 3 years. That's different than saying we forecast, or I'm forecasting that sales are going to grow at 15% for the next 3 years. Stating something as a fact and stating something as an opinion, those are different. You can state opinions, okay? Now you got to have some sort of reason for that. You've got to have a reasonable basis, okay? But your opinions, if you can come to a reasonable conclusion, you're not violating anything in the ethics material here by stating your opinion, your informed, your adequately supported opinion, okay? But if you state something as a fact, well, that's a whole different ballgame. So we're going to differentiate fact and opinion, and then we're going to clearly communicate potential losses and gains, at least to the extent that we are capable of doing so. So those that can be foreseen, those that we understand, okay, we are responsible for communicating those. In terms of guidance, okay, so we want to include the basic characteristics of securities that we're recommending or that we are taking action over. We want to inform the clients of any change in the investment process. The suitability of the investment, of course, this was one of my 3 pillars. Okay, we've got to directly consider suitability, and remember, suitability is assessed in a portfolio context. It's not the risk-return parameters of the individual asset. Rather, it's the contribution of the individual asset to the portfolio's risk and return that we've got to look at. And as the case in almost all of the stuff that we're talking about in the code and standards, anytime it involves reports or what we're saying to someone, how we're communicating information or whatever it is, okay, it's not just for written communication. We don't have to be honest and clear and complete and all that sort of stuff just when we're writing stuff down. If this is oral or this is electronic communication, if it's a formal research report, all communication is covered, not just a formally released research report. And then finally here for 5B, the inclusion or exclusion of information is going to be subject to a case-by-case review. So what's important? Well, you're going to have to decide, Maybe in some cases you need to disclose 3 years of sales growth history, in some cases 5, in some cases 15. I don't know what it is, but when you're deciding what's going to be important, you're going to have to consider what it is you're recommending, what sort of models you're using, what they're sensitive to, those types of things. And of course, we want to maintain adequate records. So that is 5B, communication with clients and prospective clients. Let's move on to 5C, okay, which is related here to our last thing on 5B. Okay, these are the formal standards with respect to record retention. So record retention, this is of course why we all got into finance, because we really love setting up record retention policies. So we want to develop and maintain the appropriate records to support our investment analyses, recommendations, actions, all that sort of stuff, and any investment related communication with clients or prospective clients. So if we are taking actions, okay, we're making recommendations, or we're communicating with clients / prospective clients, okay, well, then we've got to be communicating. We just talked about what had to be communicated in terms of the basic process, limitations, all that sort of stuff. Well, we came to those conclusions. What was communicated to clients, discussed in the previous section, okay, that was the result of diligence and a reasonable basis, okay, that supported by research. We communicated basic prospects or principles of the investment process. Okay, well, that was all done because we had some sort of data and records and something to show for our analysis, spreadsheets, 10Ks, whatever it was. Okay, well, we have to maintain those records so that if ever called on, we could explain to the client why we said X. Okay, we can go back and we can, well, here was our analysis. This is what led us to this conclusion. Yes, that was evidence to the contrary, but we looked at these 3 things. Okay, that's the way record retention works. In terms of guidance, you have to maintain the records to support your research. Okay, so that's pretty straightforward. Now the records are the firm's property, right? So you're maintaining records, they're the firm's property, and you cannot take them with you if you leave the firm, unless of course the firm consents to that. So whatever records you're retaining to support the recommendations you're making while you're an employee, those records are the property of the firm, and you have no right to them after you leave. If there's no other requirement, legal requirement or firm policy, the CFA recommends that you retain records for 7 years. After 7 years, I guess that's less important. But anyway, a 7-year retention period is what's recommended. And then, of course, in terms of recommended procedures here, well, you have a responsibility to maintain records, and that generally falls to the firm. Okay, the firm owns the records, and they're the ones that should be ensuring the records are maintained. Okay, however, okay, you as an individual, okay, have to make sure that you are following those procedures and that you're maintaining the records that would support your particular conclusion. So you still have communication with clients. You're still taking investment action. Yes, the responsibility primarily lies with the firm, but you as an individual also have some responsibility here. And remember, if you change firms, okay, you don't have access to those records anymore unless the firm consents to let you take them with you. So you could be called on to recreate the records from public sources or from your new firm's information. You can't, you have no claim in relying on the records that you kept at your former employer to support what you are doing now. So if you're ever called on to support those, or show how you arrived at particular conclusions, okay, well, you may have to recreate some data in order to do that because you don't have any claim on what you left at the old firm, because that is firm's property. And like we've said in responsibility to employers, if it belongs to the firm, you have to leave it when you leave the employment of that particular firm.